So hello and welcome. There'll probably be a ton of people rolling in, so we'll do a nice slow start. But we're doing our second series in our salmon recovery series tonight in partnership with Cascade Fisheries, Cascadia Conservation District, and Trout Unlimited. Our mission at NCW Libraries is to connect people to vital resources and opportunities that foster growth and strengthen communities. And I'm excited to help share this opportunity to learn, grow, and become involved in our local salmon recovery efforts. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight that all of our programs and spaces, we require attendees to abide by our code of conduct. I'm going to drop that link in the chat if you want to look into that more. This webinar is being recorded. And it will be available on the NCW Libraries YouTube page in about a week. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A session. So please submit your questions through the Q&A feature and reserve the chat function for any technical issues. Tonight is titled Salmon Grow on Trees, the Role of Forest Management in the Life Cycle of the Salmon. It's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Haggerty. Patrick began his career on a dairy farm, and after pursuing an education in natural resource management, he found himself exploring the world through work as a commercial fisherman, a wildlife biologist, a fisheries biologist, a wildland firefighter, and forester. And at Cascadia, he utilizes his diverse experience to provide technical assistance and conservation planning for landowners to assist in the wise stewardship of their natural resources based on sound science. His work currently focuses on improving forest health across landscapes and helping communities prepare for and recover from wildfire. Joining us as well, we have Ryan Williams, the Executive Director at Cascadia Conservation District, who will help with any Q&A at the end. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Ash. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. All right, can you all see my screen there?
Yes.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Patrick Haggerty, and I'm the Forestry Program Manager at Cascadia Conservation District. Cascadia Conservation District is a non-regulatory organization, we're dedicated to encouraging the wise stewardship and conservation of all natural resources in Chelan County. We've got a board and staff members who work cooperatively with landowners and communities to provide technical and financial assistance for soil, water, forest, fish, and wildlife conservation efforts. And our service area is all of Chelan County. So we do a lot of different types of projects, from riparian projects to wildlife, water conservation, salmon recovery, forestry work. And that forestry work is really what I'm going to talk to you about today, the nexus between forestry and salmon recovery. So now, before we jump too far into things, I want to let you know this presentation is coming from the perspective of a local practitioner. I'm not a researcher, although I love to read the research. My day-to-day involves planning and implementing projects to improving ecosystem functionality. So tonight we're going to talk about the functions of forests and how streamside vegetation, the relationship to salmon, and how local land managers are taking action to protect and enhance that relationship. So tonight we're going to talk about two important questions. Why are forests so important to fish? And what are we doing about it? Healthy forests offer many essential services to North Central Washington ecosystems. Some of these functions might be old news to you, but some may be surprising. I'm going to discuss how these functions are directly related to salmon habitat, populations, and their life cycle. And finally, we are going to hear a few local stories of how conservation practitioners are focusing on this relationship as we plan, design, implement, and monitor restoration projects. So why are forests so important? Well, stream health is closely and intricately connected to the surrounding area, the riparian habitat, that vegetation adjacent to the water, and the upland habitat beyond. Cold, clear water is essential for Pacific salmon survival. In north central Washington, it's really tough to have cold, clean water without healthy native vegetation adjacent and upland of the stream. The photos above make a strong case for this relationship, with no vegetation along Little Chumstick Creek on the right and a healthy forest surrounding Pashasson Creek. If you were a salmon, where would you like to be spawning on a hot August day? So let's talk a little bit about forest types. Forests come in all shapes and sizes, especially in our region. Much of this is tied to the vast geographic diversity we have from the Cascade Crest at Stevens Pass, where they receive over 90 inches of annual precipitation, down to the Columbia Basin, where we receive around 9 inches of precipitation in Wenatchee. This wide range of elevation and large precipitation gradient create different and diverse growing conditions for forests and incredible species diversity throughout north central Washington. As a forester, working in this rain shadow is a lot of fun because it means we get to work with a wide diversity of species, habitats, and landscapes. Sometimes a typical day might start up by the White River north of Lake Wenatchee, and I'll be working in a moist forest type with hemlocks, cedars, Doug fir that has a species composition that really almost resembles the Olympic Peninsula. And just a half an hour drive back down the road towards the office, I might stop for a site visit in Cashmere and be working in a true dry forest ecosystem with widely spaced pines that recently had a burn that moved around in a healthy fashion in the understory. And then back in Wenatchee, we'll transition back to the shrub steppe, and across the river, we're practically in the desert. So different forest types may have evolved to provide very specific functions which support salmon habitat. Old growth cedar bogs along the banks of the upper Wenatchee River, some of the biggest trees in the county, provide niche habitats we don't see often in this area, which are far different than a narrow strip of willows and cottonwoods along a small creek near the Columbia. But there are functions or relationships between salmon and forest, which are fairly consistent across forest types. When forest managers and salmon recovery organizations are sitting around the same table, these are the functions that we often gravitate towards when planning projects aimed at addressing multiple values at risk in the landscape. From salmon habitat to wildfire risk in communities, forest insects and disease outbreaks, climate change resilience, critical wildlife habitat, and more. These are the things and functions we're talking about. And then, so I'm going to talk about some of these functions specifically, and then we're going to jump into stories and case studies to see how practitioners are managing landscapes towards more functional systems in our region. One of the primary functions of forests as they relate to salmon is moderating water temperature. Water temperatures need to stay below critical thresholds during upstream migration periods for salmon. Otherwise, salmon are at risk of not making it to quality spawning grounds. Typically, salmon move upstream into the watershed to spawn at higher elevations, where it's more guaranteed to sustain cold temperatures, clean and well oxygenated water. You can see in these photos, there's a big difference of how forests are achieving this function in the Wenatchee Basin. 1.7 miles upstream of the Columbia, and the picture on the left, there's not much shade being provided by forests. While up near Lake Wenatchee, the story's a lot different. 37.4 miles upstream of the Columbia. Where would you rather spawn on a hot August day? A typical Pacific Northwest stream system food web is heavily dependent on the primary or foundational inputs from adjacent vegetation. Trees, shrubs, grasses all contribute nutrients and leaf litter to the stream, which is available to the primary consumers in the system. This works its way up the food chain to be available to the higher order consumers, with salmon often being the highest order consumer in our systems here locally, other than humans. Without healthy and resilient forests, we not only impact food for salmon, but many other important aquatic species. The roots of vegetation along stream plays the role of the glue and is key to reducing bank erosion. Here's a great example of a significant erosion event on industrial forest land in Brender Creek near Kashmir. In the timeline, you can see in 2013, a pretty nice looking forested landscape from the aerial perspective. By 2015, there's a new road that's been introduced, getting ready for some forest management. And by 2017, some significant logging occurred on this site, followed by a large storm, which created a proper gully washer and some erosion event that created some significant downcutting and incision in Brender Creek, up to 21 feet deep in places. These photos came from a report by Department of Fish and Wildlife in Chelan County, looking at ways to try and remedy and restore these types of situations. Salmon like gravels that are just the right size for building nests or redds with. Those nests are essentially just a pile of golf balls and fist-sized rocks. And once they are built, they need oxygenated water to flow through that red and across their eggs. Sand or tiny sediment particles easily clog up this system. Therefore, we pay close attention to both natural and human-caused influences of sedimentation to streams. Poorly managed forest roads can be a classic example of unnatural sedimentation. Not all roads have to be bad, but poorly maintained roads often become a major contributor of fine sediment to streams in important spawning locations. In the new Nason Ridge Community Forest, road densities are greater than 2 miles per square mile, exceeding the maximum threshold recommended by NOAA Fisheries. A forest management plan was developed for this area by community stakeholders, which includes strategies for improving the roads that are needed for forest management and recreation while decommissioning redundant roads. This is a strategy that's taken in landscapes that's very important for salmon recovery throughout the region. So we know forests are key for reducing fine sediment, but they also play an important role in reducing other harmful inputs. Sheet flows off roads during big rain events often carry a wide range of harmful compounds into our rivers and streams. This effect can be detrimental to salmon, especially juveniles and eggs. This effect can be moderated significantly by having forests act as filters between rivers and roads, parking lots, developments, or ag lands where harmful substances are sourced. Good examples of this include things like fertilizers. Forest buffers trap a high percentage of phosphorus that's bound to sediments. High levels of phosphorus can create algae blooms in lakes or rivers, which reduce oxygen levels to below the threshold salmon need to survive. Forest buffers can also have other filtering effects like uptaking of nitrogen or intercepting aerosol drift and pesticide applications, just to name a few. A couple more here, and then we'll get into how natural resource professionals are protecting and restoring these key functions. Large woody debris, log jams, root balls are all key for creating the diverse in-stream habitat needed to sustain salmon populations. Large wood is recruited from forests when snags fall into the channel or other disturbances such as landslides, avalanches, or wildfires bring wood into the stream. Log jams create pools, which are nice deep places for salmon to rest during the long migration to the spawning grounds or in between rapids. Large wood also collects fine sediment behind log jams and filters out the small cobbles into riffles and runs. This well oxygenated, often shallower water is ideal for building salmon redds. Root balls create overhangs, cover, and security habitat to avoid the overhead threat of birds, mammals, or fishermen. In the past, we tried to control rivers so that we could use the floodplain primarily for agriculture, straightening unruly rivers and building levees to keep the water in its place. We built whole cities where rivers once meandered. Now salmon runs are disappearing and people often live in dangerous floodwaters. Active floodplains create off-channel habitat, key for rearing juvenile salmon. Side channels as places for fish to shelter during high flows, and wetland complexes for important aquatic invertebrates and wildlife corridors. This is a picture of the Bremer levee on the Eniat River, a site that was purchased by Chelan Douglas Land Trust, and where the levee was removed a couple of years ago to provide access to the floodplain in this area. So local, state, and federal regulations have set minimum in-stream flow requirements for most of the watersheds in north central Washington. Water quantity is a big deal here. Our ag industry depends on it, our fish depend on it, and people depend on it. Land managers, such as the Forest Service, need to work alongside water users and community planners to look at ways in which we can keep a minimum amount of water flowing in rivers used by endangered salmon species. In many of our watersheds, 80 to 90% of our surface flow in the rivers comes from forested watersheds. So forests play a key role. They slow down snowmelt, they trap moisture in the understory, and provide wetland habitat that stores water and allows beavers to do some incredible work. You'll hear more about that from Trout Unlimited in Cody Joe's presentation next month. Many types of natural and human-associated disturbances are associated with forested systems in watersheds critical to salmon recovery. In our area, wildfire is a driving disturbance, which can have a wide range of effects on salmon, from severe to beneficial. I'll talk a bit more about that spectrum later on in the presentation. So now I'm going to shift gears. We've talked about some of the different functions forest ecosystems provide for salmon. And now I'm going to transition into talking about how land managers are identifying where forests and aquatic systems are not functioning well and provide some examples of what they're doing about it. This work takes place on multiple scales. So we'll start with an example of how watershed scale planning is being coordinated between forest managers and salmon recovery efforts. Then we'll scale down and look at some examples of specific projects aimed at restoring both forest and aquatic habitats. The Upper Wenatchee pilot project is one example of salmon recovery and forest management objectives being closely aligned. This map, it's a little tough to see here, but it tells a good story of where critical spring Chinook habitat aligns with opportunities to decommission roads, improve culverts for fish passage, and connect floodplains during forest thinning operations. This project is currently still in the planning phase, but I'm going to show you a short video clip that will provide an overview of the goals and coordination related to this project and help facilitated by the North Central Washington Forest Health Collaborative.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Vettel. I'm the district ranger for the Wenatchee District. Pretty excited to talk to you all about this project that we're taking.
It looks like we're not having audio for the video, Patrick.
Oh, okay. Stand by. Guess we should have tried this on our tech check there, huh?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you need to be muted so that it plays through there without picking up your mic, but I'm not sure.
Did that work?
No.
Okay. Well, I can kind of summarize what Jeff was talking about here. And really what the goals of this project were to look at a large scale landscape, 4 Huck 12 watersheds. And let's see if I can I can talk in the background here, and so you can at least see the landscape that we're talking about. And so the goal was really to look at comprehensive restoration, both aquatic and terrestrial, in this area. And as you can see, there has not been significant forest management in a lot of parts of these watersheds in a long time. And over 100 years of fire suppression have really led to conditions on the landscape that are a lot different than they were 100 years ago. So we know we need to bring fire back into these landscapes using things like prescribed fire and forest thinning, but we want it to be really well coordinated with aquatic work that's taking place. So sorry about that, folks. I can share some links to these videos at the end so that you can go ahead and watch them and catch the rest of the audio. So a lot of coordination is taking place here. And what has been interesting to watch throughout this project is how various state, local, and tribal planning efforts are being integrated into the U.S. Forest Service planning process so that we're not missing opportunities for salmon restoration work on federal lands that can be done concurrently with forest health treatments. The Washington DNR 20-year forest health plan identified these upper Wenatchee watersheds as high priority, as did the Upper Columbia Spring Chinook Salmon Recovery Plan, and in some relatively recent analysis from the Yakima tribe looking at stream corridor assessment and habitat restoration strategy in part of this project area. And so all of these things were kind of already aligned and going in. Then we're also trying to align it with the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest Restoration Strategy. And so it's been an interesting opportunity. This isn't a new concept by any means to be tying aquatic and forest restoration work together. But I do think we're moving towards there's certainly an effort in North Central Washington to look at how we can create better efficiencies with this work, such as, if we're going to be putting large log jams into a stream, does it make sense to have logging contractors doing some of that work while they're out in the field doing a forest health thinning project? I have another good video here that I'm going to skip over from Mariah Mayfield, who's the fish biologist for the Wenatchee River Ranger District. And she talks in this video about some of the specific types of projects that are being undertaken in this project that are occurring will be occurring simultaneous to forest management. So some of the big ones are culvert replacements, creating better fish passage. In this project area alone, over 10 miles, between 10 and 20 miles of new fish habitat is going to be opened up by replacing culverts. And also looking at roads and how we can identify those roads that are directly contributing sediment into the stream and doing maintenance to those roads while we're doing forestry work in the area. There's some great visuals in there that is really what I was hoping to show you guys. But I'll go ahead and share those links so that you can take a look at those after the presentation. So active forest management. Sorry, let me get back to my notes here. So Mariah in that video was standing in front of the Chihuahua River, which is often talked about by researchers as a reference condition river. This means that they're in relatively good shape, primarily due to lack of human interference. And restoration ecologists should strive to replicate these systems in more highly disturbed watersheds. And while the Chihuahua River itself is in pretty good shape, the photo above shows how much of the forest system is overstocked as compared to an era where regular wildfires would have naturally thinned the forest. We have several tools that are often used in forest restoration to move forest stands back into structural composition that is most appropriate for the landscape. And these are often applicable to state and private lands in our area as well. Projects like the Upper Wenatchee are conducting thinning treatments in strategic areas and spatial patterns. One of the goals of these treatments is to reduce the risk of high severity fire to riparian and in-stream habitat. The map here on the left shows treatment units that are proposed. And again, this project isn't done with the planning stage yet, but these projects will be some of the first ones in the landscape. And they're strategically located to prevent large fires from coming from the north, where they're most probable up here, into this high quality habitat in the Chihuahua River, and also towards the community of Plain and Lake Wenatchee just to the south. They're also providing opportunities to do other creative things by doing practices like thinning near meadows where conifers are encroaching into these really important wetland meadow complexes. But they're starting to change those from functioning wetlands into more forest land, which takes away this really important niche habitat. So that's an important way that forest managers are thinking about how do we improve aquatic habitat while we're out there working on forest management issues. The cutting guidelines or treatment prescriptions are always going to be different for different forest types, but typically include, for a project like this, will typically include elements such as retaining large and legacy trees, maximum diameter limits in the realm for cutting in the realm of 20 or 30 to 30 inches, retain dead and large snags for nesting and roosting habitat, maintaining large wood on the forest floor, hollowed out logs, and any trees that are showing evidence of nesting cavities for rodents and wildlife to use. No harvest or equipment within 100 feet of streams, and often underburns or prescribed fire following thinning on dry forest sites. Research and anecdotal evidence from fire managers often point to thinning followed by prescribed fire as one of the best ways to improve future wildfire outcomes in dry forests. Of course, there are many variables during a wildfire event, but combining these tools is one of the best options when appropriate for the site. Fire managers have been working on reintroducing fire in fire-dependent ecosystems for some time, and are working on finding the best ways to reintroduce fire into the dense and sensitive riparian buffers. Prescribed fire might be a good option when done by professionals at the right time and in the right place. So non-commercial thinning is another tool that's a typical practice with small private landowners, but with larger land managers like the Forest Service and Washington DNR as well. It can be a great way to still achieve some of the goals of reducing fuels and improving forest health, but to have low impact on the land by just doing all the work by hand, not having tracked equipment in any sensitive soil areas, and can be a good tool for managing insensitive habitats, such as maybe parts of spotted owl habitat or near important salmon habitat where there's a high risk of wildfires. So conservation is another tool that foresters active use to protect salmon. While active management is an important tool, we recognize that conservation is important as well. Chelan Douglas Land Trust has helped conserve many properties in the region, including 13 properties and 683 acres of forest habitat adjacent to the White River. As part of this river, they've worked with professional foresters to develop forest management plans for many of the properties and identify opportunities to enhance the forest structure in ways that will accelerate old growth forest structure characteristics and sustain fish and wildlife habitat. Additionally, they were able to work with Cascade Fisheries enhancement to add large woody debris to a system that was shown to be significantly lacking. These structures are helping to improve spawning, rearing, and security habitat on the White River. I had a great video from Jason Lundgren's group at Cascade Fisheries Enhancement about using local materials to get wood to put into the White River, and with some good visuals of that conservation area. And I really encourage folks to go up there and take a look at the White River and explore those preserves if you get a chance. But I'll include this link in the chat as well. That's not working, right? Ash?
No, you can hear like one or two notes of the music every once in a while.
How about now?
It's quiet and kind of cutting out every once in a while.
Let's get
The White River display.
makes to skip a slide on me after I shut that down.
And we can also include these in an email to everyone after as well, in case you don't have time to click on all of the links in the chat.
Sorry, folks. freezing up on me.
Hi, I'm David Morgan. I'm with
Well, it looks like technology is pushing me into the corner on this one, but another cool project that I wanted to talk to you guys about was a floodplain reconnection project on the Eniat River, where there's a home that was frequently being flooded, and the land trust was able to purchase the property, and then Cascadia Conservation District worked with them to remove the house, move it to an upland property a couple miles down the road. And then we were able to create new off-channel habitat in that area, and a wetland complex that is now replant the area, and it's now turning into a healthy riparian buffer between the road and the river. So foresters are always working on reforestation. It's job security. In this project, Cascadia CD planted native species in an old pasture. The goals of this were to filter nutrients from adjacent agricultural practices, improve fish and wildlife habitat, increase shade, and reduce water temperatures. In this example, previous to this project, the cows had direct access to the creek and were doing some pretty significant damage. And so by providing some exclusion fencing and planting, we're able to initiate that riparian buffer between the ag land and the stream. Now, so this isn't really, what we might consider traditional forestry work, but I think it's a really important part of how forest ecosystems play a critical role in the life cycle and the health and the salmon recovery process. We're eventually even able to add some beaver dam analog structures into these creeks, into parts of these creeks. And when we were doing that, we were able to work with the adjacent landowner where we did some forest management planning with them, and they were able to reduce the fuels on their landscape through some commercial and non-commercial harvests. And then we were able to directly use some of that wood to put right into the creek across the street. So following high severity fires, it's typical to see significant erosion events, post-fire flooding, and sedimentation that can negatively impact spawning habitat. Here you see a culvert that may have been large enough to handle a typical flood event, but it was not large enough to handle an extraordinary event after the 2015 Okanagan Complex fire. A wide variety of practices are used by land managers following large fire events to mitigate post-fire effects. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but things like seeding and reforestation, salvage harvest, poling and upsizing culverts and erosion control structures are all things that we're doing after nearly every fire in north central Washington. So tonight, I hope that I helped answer a couple of questions that are really important to salmon recovery. Why are forests so important to fish? And what are we doing about it? There's so many more ways that salmon and trees are connected. Salmon carcasses bring important marine nutrients back to upper watersheds. Forest thinning can be done strategically to optimize snowpack retention. Large scale conservation efforts are protecting entire watersheds. And so there's infinitely more things that we could talk about related to this subject, but I hope that tonight was a good primer for you to learn about what the salmon recovery process is doing and how it's coordinating with forest managers in our area. And again, I'm sorry about those videos. So that shortened up the presentation by a few minutes here, but we got plenty of time for questions and answers, and I'll try and track down the links to those so that I can stick them in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I am gonna throw out a
Sharing
few,
the screen in order to do that in just a minute.
I'm gonna throw out a few polls, and just so that people can, like, we can gather some information as we do some of our question answering here. But one of the questions that we've gotten so far is someone said, I'm curious about the impact of thinning efforts and the prescribed fires on increasing sedimentation in the rivers.
Sorry, Ash, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So the impact of thinning efforts and prescribed fires on increasing sedimentation in the rivers.
So is the question,
You're just
is
curious.
thinning? Oh, okay. Yeah. So oftentimes forest management, you know, there's a wide range of what a thinning project could look like. You know, the conservation district, we work with a lot of small private landowners on the 10 to 20 acre scale. And there's forest practice regulations that really guide making sure none of that work happens within generally like a 75 to 125 foot corridor along rivers and streams. So there's generally always going to be a pretty significant buffer that's not going to have any management at all. And so really the management upstream and generally kind of, you know, if you're practicing good forestry practices, you're probably going to be feathering that kind of treatment upland so that you're trying to reduce any sedimentation that could occur. There could be some short-term impacts to some of those projects, and certainly like we saw in that Brender Creek project, there can be major long-term impacts as well.
Yeah. I actually was also curious about some of the changes in like forest management in recent years in terms of like how that's been impacting the river, or if there's been big changes recently that you've seen that we're doing in our forest management around here.
Sure. You know, I think there's kind of two ways to answer that question. I think one way would be, you know, how are the major disturbances we're seeing to our forests, such as high severity wildfires affecting our rivers and salmon recovery? I think that's a huge question, and probably, you know, that's the way that we're seeing most of our forests being managed right now, right, is through fire. And so you look at a watershed like the Aniat watershed that's experienced an incredible amount of fire. You know, 75–80% of that watershed has burned, and much of it has burned 2 or 3 times over the last 20 to 30 years. And so, you know, I mean, you hear stories about after 2015, for example, the Aniat fish hatchery, that crew was up for like 72 hours straight trying to clean sediment and ash out of the round pens that were where they had their salmon, just trying to keep the fish alive. And so, you know, that's a very real world example of just, you know, the fish were being suffocated by the amount of ash coming down from those events. In terms of how, you know, forest managers are actively managing forest lands and how that's changed in recent years, I think, you know, the Okanagan Wenatchee Forest Restoration Strategy came out in 2012, and that's really guided this process of really taking a holistic look at a landscape and so first looking at, how is the landscape departed from what the kind of natural conditions might be, and then kind of looking at that range of what it would have been looking like naturally, and then really dialing in using advanced techniques like lidar data from planes and drones to really understand, okay, where do we need to do work on this landscape to really balance out the different types of forest structures and patterns that would have been healthy historically when we had natural fire regimes. So that, I think that kind of mindset is driving some good ecological forestry, but there's a wide range of practices, and sometimes it is on private industrial forest land. It really depends on the owners. I think if there's folks that are in it for the long haul, you see often really good forest management, and if it's folks that are just turning the property over is when you tend to see not as sustainable forest management in terms of providing long-term yield and job opportunities and infrastructure in the timber economy here.
And how do you see like the role of forest management changing in the future as like we're getting different climate change impacts happening and bigger community growth and that kind of things?
Sure. Well, we talk about all this need for forest restoration. The Nature Conservancy did a study in 2014 where they identified, over 1.7 million acres of dry forest in kind of north central Washington area that were in need of some sort of restoration and thinning work. And one thing that's really recognized is that we need a strong, forest products industry to be able to do some of that work, and a lot of it. That's something that we are, lacking here in north central Washington. So, I think, I don't even know the number of mills that we had at one point at our height, but there was 7 or 8 mills just in the upper Wenatchee Valley. And so, we don't have a mill now within over 100 miles of Wenatchee. And so, those types of things are kind of some major drivers of how are we going to accomplish this work. We know there's a huge amount of work that needs to be accomplished, and the work is definitely changing in light of climate change, right? So there's a lot of, when we're evaluating landscapes, or the Forest Services, for instance, often looking at things like what are the future conditions going to be 50 years from now? Should we be planting different species in there, or thinning to different densities that are going to be more drought tolerant of these future conditions?
Interesting. We had a participant drop a looks like the Upper Wenatchee pilot project story map with videos into our chat. I was just going to share.
Oh, perfect. That had a couple of the videos on it, and I'll grab the other one.
Okay. Let's see. We have another question. It says, more houses and associated septic systems going in along the Iniat. How will this affect salmon habitat?
Okay, so the question is, there's more houses and was it secondary houses?
Septic systems.
Oh, septic systems. Sure. I mean, that, I think that's really getting at that's really getting at that floodplain connectivity piece, right? And so we know that that's a really limiting factor for certain life stages of salmon, particularly off channel and overwinter habitat that's important for overwintering juveniles. And so when we have these like more houses going up in the Entiat, sure, we need places for people to live, but oftentimes, you know, we have chosen historically and still do want to build in nice flat places like floodplains. And so then we lose opportunities, right, to reconnect those areas and create that off-channel habitat that is really lacking in that system. And you know, when the researchers are really looking at what are the limiting life stages of like endangered like spring Chinook, for example, in the Entiat, then they're really trying to dial into, okay, where are we losing most of these fish? Is it in the dams? Is it in the oceans? Is it as juveniles in these? Is it in the spawning grounds? And so that's where, you know, things like more development in the floodplain are just going to, you know, it does reduce the opportunity for future restoration work in those areas. And certainly septics, you know, are always problematic. They're hard to maintain and you know, regulate over time. So we've seen that be a huge issue on the west side for sure, around the Puget Sound, and yeah, I'm sure it's you know, something that we would be talking about more if we had a higher population density here.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in right now. So if you have questions, now is the time to ask them. I am going to launch a quick poll right now. It talks about if you're interested in volunteering on any habitat related projects that are coming up or any other series that you're interested in learning about. I don't know if you had any additional things that you wanted to share, Patrick or Ryan.
No, I just would really thank everybody for coming and participating tonight. I thought Ash and I did a great job of testing our technology before we started, but I obviously failed, so sorry about that, and appreciate your patience. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Conservation District has a lot of programs and resources for private landowners, so if you're thinking about doing some of this work on your property, or you know folks that might be interested in participating in a planting or salmon recovery or forestry project, feel free to let us know, and I'll put my email in the chat once again.
Do you have any of those projects coming up soon?
We do, yeah, we always have those sorts of projects coming up. We have lots of planting projects planned for this spring and fall. We have some beaver dam analog projects. We have thinning projects that are happening. We have some exciting projects where we're doing fuel reduction projects and trying to put that wood straight into the creek, and so really trying to make these projects go full circle as much as we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. We appreciate your time and your commitment to our ecological health in the area. Please join us next month for the third and final webinar in this series called Beaver Powered Restoration with Cody Joe Jaspers from Trout Unlimited. And then you can learn about any other upcoming events for NCW Libraries on our website at ncwlibraries.org or by following us on Facebook. And thank you all for your time tonight.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.